Alrighty. Okay, thanks for everyone for joining today. I'm sure there's a few people who kind of like flow in as the meeting's beginning, but I've brought in an external speaker, Alex, who is from my old climate research lab at SFU. He's a PhD student, and he's going to talk to us today about nature-based CO2 removal solutions. So whenever you're ready, Alex, feel free to share your screen. And yeah.
Okay. What I want to do. Oh boy. One sec. I got mixed up there. Sorry, folks.
No worries.
I've only really ever used this Google thing, one-on-one meeting. I've never used it with like an actual or to present things, just like look at code and stuff with a singular colleague. I always find it a little bit odd staring out into the abyss here of my presentation.
I liked it when I liked it when I was doing my master's defense because I didn't get to see anybody's face if they were like disappointed in what I was saying.
But yeah, no, good. Okay, so my name's Alex. I'm a PhD candidate at Simon Fraser University from Chloe's former lab, the climate research lab in the geography department. Today, I'm going to talk about nature-based climate solutions, why we need to think about them, what are the risks of not thinking about them or even implementing them if we do choose to implement them, what are some of the rewards for implementing them. So this is probably going to be a little bit of a casual style presentation. It's going to be about a half hour. I hope that works out. You guys have what, like an hour, right, Chloe?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, okay, so it'll be somewhere around a half hour, maybe a little longer if I get on a tangent by accident. So yeah, that'll be kind of fun. I'm still getting used to the whole talking to the abyss thing. So bear with me a little bit. Right, so we're gonna talk about nature-based solutions, but before we talk about nature-based solutions, specifically nature-based climate solutions, we need to talk about something else. The first thing we need to talk about is actually what's called net zero. Now you probably all heard this. This is hopefully a little bit redundant information for everybody, but a number of companies and countries such as Canada have committed to, some formally, some not formally, to having net zero carbon dioxide emissions or net zero carbon emissions or something like that by the year 2050, around about mid-century. It's all the rage right now. Everyone's doing it, from big companies such as Microsoft to governments such as Canada, China, the United States, all trying to get to net zero by 2050. And one of the things we might be wondering, and I'm going to talk about here the research behind this, is why would we be to net zero and what does that actually mean for us? So net zero is relevant because something which climate science has figured out over the past couple of decades is that a unit of carbon dioxide emissions yields about an equivalent unit of temperature change. So a unit of carbon dioxide emissions yields a proportional change in temperature. Now that proportional change in temperature persists throughout time, basically for millennia. And one of the things this also means is that if we bring carbon dioxide emissions to zero, which is the light blue line in this graph, we will actually stabilize global warming at whatever level it was at prior to reaching zero CO2 emissions. Now, this light blue line assumes that all the other greenhouse gases and emissions and such balance each other out. And so there's not really much additional warming from those things. But the case in point really is, we're really concerned about climate change and we're really concerned about global warming. We need to bring carbon dioxide emissions to zero in order to stop global warming at that level that it's already at. So we got to get to zero. Unfortunately, getting to zero requires two things. One, we have to bring down anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions. That is paramount. That is the biggest thing which needs to happen. So that means reducing things like aviation emissions, car emissions, oil and gas emissions, any kind of number of things which produce carbon dioxide, coal emissions, liquid natural gas, those kind of things all have to be reduced as much as is possible. Unfortunately, not all those things can be reduced in a timely manner. Some of them will probably never be able to reduce. And so we have to balance these unavoidable carbon dioxide emissions with removals. Removals mean taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in some way, shape, or form. There are a couple of technological ways of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but the best way, the most viable way, is actually to use plants. And we use plants by just increasing photosynthesis. So all we're trying to do is just increase photosynthesis, and that will take more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And so we reach something which is now being called nature-based climate solutions. That has started out over kind of a different set of terms. So nature-based climate solutions fall under the umbrella category of nature-based solutions. And the thing with nature-based solutions is there are restoration, protection, and management solutions for the land that benefit human well-being and biodiversity. So they have to benefit human well-being and biodiversity. They can be protection, they can be restoration, and they can be sustainable management type of actions. So for natural climate solutions, one of the things which has to be there in order for them to be effective is they have to provide additional carbon dioxide sequestration, or what we may call drawdown. And that additionality has to be more than what would otherwise occur without these nature-based solutions. So if we want to have that extra carbon dioxide sequestration to get that net in net zero, it has to be additional. There's a number of actions that could fall into this category. I've just listed a few. The biggest one is reforestation. So that's reforesting historically deforested areas, so areas that used to be forests kind of thing. Or it could be restoration of forests that have been disrupted by some means. Regenerative agriculture is something which is actually quite viable and could also have huge co-benefits for agriculture and food security and water security. Coastal restoration has a number of big co-benefits with it as well, such as adaptation for climate change stressors, such as storm surges. Green spaces has big benefits for human well-being, biodiversity, and urban spaces. Conservation may or may not provide additionality, but it certainly has a lot of co-benefits to it. So if we're looking at what could be called a typical future emissions pathway, such as business as usual, we need that first thing, the fossil fuel mitigation, so to bring down carbon dioxide emissions from other sources. And the things that we can't bring down, we take out with nature-based climate solutions is probably the simplest way of doing it, the most cost-effective way of doing it. It doesn't require new technology. You just plant plants. It's basically the whole idea. So that helps us bring down to zero faster. And we're actually going to look later on at a study that I helped recently publish where we see the effect of actually this green area. We did just this study in a climate model recently. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what I think are the three big questions of nature-based climate solutions. Now, these are three big questions for both climate science itself, so people like me, as well as for people like you, data industry, data people who might be interested in nature-based climate solutions, either as offsets or as getting involved in this work in some way. So the first thing, which is very big for data science, is there enough space available? So in order to have additional carbon dioxide emissions or additional carbon dioxide sequestration and to plant new plants, got to make sure there is space available. And that's going to require a lot of mapping, a lot of satellite imagery, a lot of remote sensing type work. The next big question is, can we achieve enough additional carbon sequestration to offset ongoing emissions? This is a difficult question to answer for a number of reasons. And so I'm going to be going over a bit of the science behind this, but it's also a very important question and can be quite helped with a lot of data science as well. The third thing is whether or not this action will stabilize global temperature. I'm not going to get into huge details on the third one because it's kind of a big question for science at the moment. And there's enough co-benefits with doing these actions that we may or may not need to worry about the third one, but still, it is a very important thing. We're trying to stabilize global temperature. So we're going to talk about that at the very end. Okay, so the first question. Basically, the research does say that there is available space for, first, this would be reforestation or new forests. It could be either way. So basically, there is space available for nature-based climate solutions. Take the map on the left, showing actual forest coverage as percentage of land space derived from observational data, and then the figure on or the map on the right is the same type of information, so forest coverage as percentage of land area, but this is derived from a machine learning algorithm which identified where trees could be and where they should be. So the coverage of forests is where they could and should be based off of machine learning algorithms. So if you actually take the map on the right and you minus the map on the left, you get the potential, the available restoration area. And so this study from Baston and colleagues, this was actually quite an infamous study that came out in 2009 in the journal Science. It's infamous for a lot of reasons. They came up with a restoration area potential of about 900 million hectares or 9 million kilometers squared. You see these units kind of interchangeably used throughout the science here. One of the things which I found really weird about this study is they have all this restoration area way up north, which I've never really understood whether or not trees would grow. This look at like up in Ellesmere Island, they got trees growing. Or where they could grow. I don't know how the machine algorithm found that trees could grow in all these spots, but that was one of the controversial things. Suffice it to say, a number of other studies have reconfirmed that there is a significant area available for restoration in the tropics and kind of subtropics regions and in the mid-latitudes. So ignoring this like high latitude areas, there is still a lot of space available for restoration. So that's a good thing, there's space. The other thing is that there might even be even more space, because in the real world, we don't actually need new forests. We don't need 20% of tree coverage or higher. We actually just need like some new trees. Any new trees could be helpful. And so for these, you can do different things like shifting agricultural practices, regenerative farming, so like reducing tillage, or agroforestry, which is image that we see going on in kind of the left there. So just any new trees can help. But in order to figure out like if we can just plant any new trees or what the areas of trees are, we actually need to look at this in more fine scale resolution. And the science hasn't done that many studies that I'm aware of looking at super fine scale resolution. This is more from a comment paper as opposed to an actual research paper. On the left, this is also using machine learning algorithms to identify trees. We have an area, I think, in Uganda where they identified trees at the 25 centimeter resolution from aerial photos, and also in Uganda at the 3 meter resolution from satellite data from a company called Planet. And so what this can tell us, if we're using like super fine scale satellite or remote sensing information, is existing coverage of trees, where more trees could be planted, and whether or not that's actually going to interfere with agriculture. So is that going to interfere with things like food security? Things you got to keep in mind here is probably don't want to reduce our food supply. Okay, sorry. Okay, so there's space. There's lots of space. So what does the research say about whether or not there is a sequestration potential, whether or not we can sequester ongoing emissions? An older study now-ish, older, it's been updated a bit, but it's still a really good study. This study by Griscom and colleagues said if we combine a number of nature-based climate solutions and aggregate them together by the year 2030, assuming a high cost of carbon, you could get about 11.3 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent sequestered per year. This is about a third of the current level of emissions, just a little bit under a third of the current level of emissions. It's unclear whether or not you would get this level every year for say 10 years or every year for say 20 years. But at the year 2030, according to observational data, the scientists did estimate about a third of the current emissions could be sequestered by nature-based solutions. And so if we look at just the reforestation aspect of this, Cook, Patton and colleagues found that this reforestation line is actually about 700 million hectares of space. So that's actually pretty high up there, similar to the map that we saw earlier. And this equals about 5 gigatons of carbon dioxide removed per year, which is a significant amount. I would argue 5 is a lot of emissions. It's not quite a third, but it's still a lot of emissions. There's a lot of potential there. That's basically what we're trying to say here. However, the system, those figures were all made from observations, and the Earth's system is definitely a dynamic thing, and their climate change is ongoing. It currently does happen, and there are a number of risks from climate change that can disrupt a nature-based solution, specifically forests. So we can look at this as things like insects, fire, drought, pests. The other thing is humans. Now, these risks are, some of them more or less caused by climate change directly. Some of them are indirectly caused by climate change, where they have interaction effects where the climate system changes and there's some sort of effects that go on, and then the fires happen and such like that. But climate change can disrupt our nature-based solutions. They can disrupt our forests. They can disrupt our agricultural spaces. And therefore, they could disrupt our sequestration potential, which is one of the reasons why we would be implementing a nature-based solution. So, sorry, my mouse is like half broken. So if we look at permanence and risk, or if we look at risk, it can affect basically the permanence of the carbon dioxide sequestration. And it can affect it in a few ways. If we have, from our map that we saw, or our graph we saw earlier, net zero carbon dioxide emissions, we get constant global temperature. And so that should lead to a constant risk, where none of these risks really compound over time or grow together over time. However, from today onwards, as we go towards net zero emissions, we will be increasing the risk to nature-based climate solutions and to the natural ecosystems. So increasing risk is going to happen until we get to net zero. So that will disrupt our potential sequestration and the permanence time of our sequestration. And for any period that we have positive emissions, that risk will stay increased. And these risks can compound together to effectively render our actions useless, which would be a bummer. Okay, so there's not a lot of studies out there that look at nature-based solutions in terms of permanence, so whether or not they are permanent. One recently came out last week from my old supervisor, David Matthews, and colleagues of which I was a part. I'm going to go over these couple figures from this. And what we did in this study is we reforested about 400 million hectares. So that's a little bit less than the Griscom paper there said that we could reforest, but it's still a significant amount of reforestation. And we found a couple of very interesting things. One, even if we reforest that much more or that much area, we will reduce the peak in temperature compared to some other baseline. So we compared it to what's called a shared socioeconomic pathway, the lowest one. And we did find that it reduces peak temperature. We also found that you can increase ecosystem biomass, which is very good for co-benefits. We even found that if you reduce the effect of kind of side effects of doing reforestation, you may actually be better suited to use a different type of action, such as regenerative agriculture or soil carbon sequestration. I'm going to explain a little bit more about that in a second. So there are a lot of benefits, basically, so I'm trying to say here, to implementing reforestation at a large scale, even if it's not permanent. Because in this scenario, what we did is we returned all of the new forests back to being agricultural land. And so none of it stayed as forest. So none of the carbon that we sequestered, additionally sequestered, stayed sequestered. It was all returned to the atmosphere. And even though it was not permanently stored, we did see some interim benefits. Okay, the final thing about sequestration potential that I wanted to mention is accounting for additionality. I haven't personally come across many studies yet that talk about additionality with quite a framework for how you would think about additionality. So I thought I'd include just some of my own thoughts on what should be included if we're thinking about additionality. I think additionality should first look at the question of whether or not the action produces carbon sequestration that would not otherwise occur. What I mean by that is that if you take an area, just any sort of forest, or an area that isn't forest, or something like that, plants will grow better under higher levels of carbon dioxide. So if we're having positive emissions, some areas will see an increase in carbon dioxide sequestration no matter whether or not we implement a nature-based solution or not. And so we have to account for that, the climate system effect on plants, in whether or not we're accounting for additionality. I haven't seen any carbon projects, so like forests that are being used as offset projects that account for this aspect of things, the CO2 fertilization effect, but it is something that I think should be accounted for. And so we should have different sets of baselines. So you need a baseline for the current state of the location and the current status of carbon in that location, as well as a baseline for how that location would change under different climate change scenarios. So how that area would change under different levels of warming and different levels of carbon dioxide. And then we would have to monitor those locations in order to account for additionality and compare it against both baselines. The monitoring could be done at different temporal scales, as well as different graphic scale or geographic scales. And finally, the last and probably the most complicated aspect of what is actually a really complicated subject is stabilizing climate change. So again, one of the big things we're trying to do with a nature-based climate solution is to stabilize climate change. We know there's area for it. We know there's sequestration potential, but we don't really know if we can fully stabilize climate change. We've had one study that came out last week, shows that we might be able to help a little bit. We didn't fully address that question in that study, and we're working on this question now in our own research lab. But I'll go over some of the problems to stabilizing climate change with a nature-based solution, such as reforestation. So first off, we have these biophysical effects if you change the land system from one state to another. If you take, say, a bare land or agricultural area, and then you plant a forest on it, you will change the amount of sunlight that gets reflected. You will change the amount of evaporation, which is actually the amount of heat that gets added to the atmosphere. And then you will change what's called the sensible heat. So again, the amount of heat that gets added to the atmosphere. Now, depending on your location, whether or not in the tropics or, say, the boreal forest, these changes happen differently. So if you're in the boreal forest, you would get actually quite a big change in reflected sunlight, especially in the winter season when you mask snow. And you might get a smaller change in things like evaporation. This has an effect where we plant the forests or where we implement nature-based solutions latitudinally may make a difference in how that action stabilizes climate. And then there are also these biogeochemical changes. So if you change the land system, you can change the fluxes of volatile or organic carbons, which are also greenhouse gases or precursors. Then you can change the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is also a potent greenhouse gas. You can change the methane cycle, also a potent greenhouse gas. So those things can affect global warming. And then we have all these Earth system dynamics that are going on. So we can change the carbon cycle. Any sort of change in carbon dioxide is a change in the carbon cycle. We can have fires that will then add more carbon back to the atmosphere. So say fires in our nature-based solution area, that could be very damaging. We could have droughts. Droughts would add carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. Permafrost thaw, which is kind of in a different location. Looking at sea ice feedbacks, all sorts of things going on in the Earth system as a result of our actions or as a result of ongoing climate change that could make it that so our nature-based solutions actions do not perhaps stabilize climate change. So there's big question marks there. However, I think nature-based climate solutions are quite necessary. Looking at a couple of figures from the new IPCC report, we can see that if we do nothing, or even if we get stabilized temperature at around 1.5 degrees of global warming since the pre-industrial area, we would get a lot of warming compared to where we used to have it, more amplified in the poles. And as warming continues, we get more warming across the globe. This changes precipitation patterns. Some areas get drier, some areas get wetter. And that leads to, for the land, what I think is one of the main risks of not doing anything, which is that we could end up in like very serious droughts across the globe. I personally think that droughts are a society-changing process and something that should be taken very seriously and mitigated against. Also, as we very well know from living in COVID, extreme events create instability. Instability is not good for the economy. It's not good for anything. It's not really good for our lives. So I think that resilience is required. I think nature-based solutions do provide a lot of resilience to our ecosystems. I think they provide a lot of benefits to biodiversity, which possibly outweigh even the risks of not knowing whether or not they stabilize climate change. And I think that there are things that could be implemented today at scale. So that's kind of the gist of what I had to say. Thank you very much. I've put together, and I'm going to send this to Chloe, a list of useful resources for you guys to check out on your own time, of websites that I either look at myself all the time or would refer to for information. A lot of the stuff I was talking about can be found on Carbon Plan's website. This is one of my favorite websites these days. They'll go through this whole thing about the risks to reforestation. They've got a lot of good resources on that. They've got a lot on carbon markets, forest carbon markets for on there, and kind of the pitfalls of forest carbon markets. When I was talking about carbon dioxide removal, there's actually an online book by Holly Buck and Roger Ains called the CDR Primer. So they talk about all the things of carbon dioxide removal. Project Drawdown is a very interesting project that explains a lot about lowering carbon dioxide emissions. Planet is a company, possibly similar, not quite similar. You guys, this is some company has a bunch of satellites, so they offer spatial data at different resolutions. Canada has what's called a Net Zero Advisory Board. So these group delivers advice to the federal government on viable pathways to reach net zero. They just came out with a report the other day that surprisingly says very little about removing carbon dioxide, so nothing really in the net aspect of net zero. But okay, HILDA is actually an open historic land dynamics assessment. So it's a map, basically forest coverage and land use change. It's open, and I think anyone can get that data. Carbon Brief, very good website explaining climate change to normal people. Stripe, I've included Stripe. It's a big company. They sell carbon offsets, so Stripe Climate sells carbon offsets. I mostly included them because one of the lead writers and scientists from Carbon Brief now is part of Stripe. And he is the type of person who would take in consideration a lot of the risks and such to climate change. So the nature-based solution, so he is probably going to help revamp their carbon offsetting program. So I would expect this company to actually have one of the more like scientifically sound carbon offset purchasing schemes pretty soon. And then there's the Global Forest Watch, which assesses carbon storage globally. and World Resources Institute, which has studies of food, forest, water, energy, climate, ocean, and cities. Oh, kicks. I'm not excited. How do I get out of this thing?
All right, awesome. Thanks so much for that, Alex. That was super interesting. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, we'll move into the discussion. Anybody? Oh, here we go. Whoever was first, I just need to open the queue.
Go ahead, James.
Oh, thanks, Thomas. Yeah, Alex, great presentation. Really interesting.
Thanks.
What do you think is the biggest blocker to actually starting planting trees somewhere like Canada? Is it land ownership? Is it government buy-in? Or
I don't think it's government buy-in, especially because the government has a program established to plant trees in both urban areas and non-urban areas. In the tree planting world, they call them Trudeau trees. Had a number of friends who supposedly planted Trudeau trees. So planting, what, 2 billion or something? So I think government definitely supports the planting of new trees in different spaces. Land ownership is probably one of the bigger hurdles in Canada, but a number of a lot of the forested area isn't owned by the companies that are using it. Kind of like out in like the BC wilderness, as you may or may not be aware, a lot of that's leased land. So there's lease agreements in there, but those lease agreements are quite long, typically like 25 years type thing. So those kind of legal frameworks that are around how we've organized our resource sector is probably a big hurdle to establishing, carbon forests and stuff like that. And the onus may or may not be on individual companies to be like, okay, hey, we're going to take a section of our leased land to just grow this forest and hold it for 100 years or something.
cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Cool. I think, Tomer, did you have your hand up at one point?
Yeah. Sorry, I don't have my camera on. I'm still a bit sick here. But yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation, Alex. Really interesting stuff. I have a question about old growth trees. Obviously, it's pretty controversial right now in the province, and sometimes I hear an argument that says something along the lines of in the coming years, with all this global warming, that these trees might die off anyways. So cutting them now helps to sequester that carbon and then also frees up the forest floor for new growth. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, if you think, just what you think.
Yeah, that sounds like a very industry-based argument. I mean, it makes some sense. Okay, I'll do the industry side of it first. There's a way in which it makes sense that if you take a very large old growth tree that is going to die and you cut it down and you use that lumber for a product that's in, say, furniture, right? You build some really high-end furniture with it. That furniture is going to be around for a couple hundred years, maybe, if it's really well made. And there are carpenters and stuff who've talked about that's being one of the reasons why they do what they do. And so that carbon's not going to go back in the atmosphere. And from a climate change perspective, there's a way in which that makes sense. From a biodiversity and ecological perspective, this argument makes absolutely zero sense. The way old growth forests work is that trees do die. They don't die en masse, but when they do die, they become the lifeblood of more growth within the forest. And so you need individual trees falling, preferably not a lot of them at once, in order to have more trees growing. And it's part of the natural succession of forests that it's okay if the trees die on their own. And even if climate change does cause them all to die at once, it would actually help the resilience of the forest if we just left them where they were and didn't touch them after they died. Because then the way succession functions is that the new species that come in would be more resilient to whatever climate there is and would then sequester more carbon and have more of a kind of adaptive baseline. So yeah, it's not biologically a sound argument, but I can see where they come from a climate change perspective.
Cool.
I wouldn't recommend cutting down old growth trees.
Thanks.
Yeah, James, you had a question?
I did. Alex, that was a really good presentation. Thanks for that.
Thanks.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on how companies can report this stuff to broader publics, like the ESG reporting metrics, and like these companies are going to be on a cadence that they have to report this to, so people will invest so they can make money. How do you tie that together?
I don't know what the ESG reporting metrics are.
Pardon me. So it's environmental, societal, and governance. So it's like these metrics that how good a company is doing in these dimensions of like humanity.
Yeah.
So environment is like how well does Pepsi manage their, physical placements? Like, are they responsible to the community, to the physical environment? Are they pulling out too much water? Nestle obviously does not like this stuff. So anyway, these are just examples, but like, I'm curious if you have thought about how like companies can track this level of information for mitigation purposes.
Yeah,
to establish their baselines.
Yeah, so I've got a little bit of a sense. So some of the figures I showed were actually from a study we did for Microsoft. They paid for some of that research for us, and part of it is because there's a lot of science going on right now to figure out baselines and to figure out whether or not they're buying up carbon offsets, en masse right now, and they're trying to figure out whether or not that those actually account for additionality, or whether or not that they're like worth the money that they're paying, or how to account for them. And so what we tried to establish was that you can't guarantee that what you've sequestered is permanently sequestered. Currently, there's almost no guarantee to that. And so they wanted to factor that into their purchasing of carbon offsets to say, okay, we offset, but we only offset for 20 years, or we only offset for 40 years, kind of thing. So we'll take out, let's say 20 gigatons of carbon dioxide over a 20-year period, and then it goes back in. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to take all supply line, basically every aspect of their company, and account for its carbon, and then use these offsets in probably referring to their ESG metrics. I don't really know exactly, but using these offsets as part of that accounting. So it's like if you've got Pepsi, I'll take with Pepsi, it's a little easier for me to think about. If you got Pepsi delivering trucks, right? And you can very easily track how much carbon those trucks are putting in the atmosphere. That's a very easy calculation. Then okay, over a 20-year period, those Pepsi trucks are putting in, Y amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So we're going to plant such and such amount of trees to then offset that over that 20-year period, but it's only valid for so long, right? Kind of like establishing a validity. I don't know if this is making any sense.
No, it totally is, because like there is a lifespan on how long these things can last. So if you're doing ESG metrics, shit happens. So you have to adapt to that in 5 years. Like a plan there's a million sayings about a plan, but like until you have to actually put it into action, it's not worth anything, right?
Yeah. So I guess what I would think is that they probably work best if they had some kind of time constraint around them and be like, okay, these things are valid for only so long.
Interesting.
And then you have to plant new ones or do something else.
Cool. Thank you.
No problem.
Kayla, I saw you had your hand raised a little bit ago. Did you still have a question?
Well, I was just kind of curious about the initial data that you had for like the restoration area. Did you say you don't know the exact parameters that went into defining that?
Which one?
It was looking at like the current forested areas.
Yeah, that one. So yeah, that was from the 2009 study came out in Science, in the journal Science. Very controversial study. One of the reasons it was controversial is they had their machine algorithm define where forests should be. So they ran their machine algorithm through a set of thousands of images of trees. in different kind of representing different biomes, basically, of the planet. And then they said, okay, in different biomes, you expect there to be this percentage of coverage of trees, you know? And then it's kind of the way it worked, or like this kind of, it's more or less biomes based. And then they applied that, okay, all of these biomes exist in these places, so now all of these biomes should have this percentage of trees. Unfortunately, when it came out, the final result had a lot of trees way up north where it's like, I don't know if there are trees up there. I don't think so. I think it's tundra or ice. And so they ended up in areas where you wouldn't actually expect trees to grow just because it was fully AI based. So that was like one of the controversies of that study. Still though, around like the mid latitudes to the tropics kind of zone, it was actually pretty accurate. And other studies did more or less confirm that, yeah, in those areas, you would, some of them expect trees. But they also had trees growing in deserts, to be honest, that were like, I looked into the background data for that a few years ago. It's like, they had trees growing in deserts and all kinds of places. Because, you know, if you think of an image of a desert, sometimes you'll see like a cactus, right? And so the machine learning algorithms saw these cactuses. They thought, oh, cactuses exist in deserts. All deserts, you know, and it didn't really fully understand. Stats, you know, linear stats is only so good.
And did they look at like urban, like land use and that sort of thing, or was it just like?
Yeah, did they? I can't remember.
Yeah.
That's a good question. I know that yes, they would have, because the actual forest coverage map accounted for that.
Okay.
I think I can't remember.
Yeah, I'm just super interested in the aspect of carbon sequestering on like residential properties.
Oh,
so,
yeah,
like urban, like landscaping.
yeah,
And so that side of it, I'm like really intrigued about at this point in my life.
yeah. I don't know if that study got as to that scale. I can't remember what scale they went to, but I know that like, yeah, you'd have to go pretty fine scale to figure that out. Like, you know, at the centimeter level or meter at the most, like meter squared at the most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is very fine scale and very data intensive.
Absolutely. Yeah. Cool.
But
Thank you.
fun.
Yeah.
Al in the chat asked, should I plant a tree?
Sure.
Yeah.
Why not? Where do you live? What kind of tree are you planting?
Well, I guess that's my question.
If you should or should not, or what type
Fruit
of
trees.
tree?
He's in Hamilton. Fruit trees.
Yeah. I'm in beautiful East Hamilton here.
Oh yeah, you got a lot of
I don't
trees.
know. Yeah, do these work as well? Is this the same idea? More houseland?
I mean, that's a different
Or
thing.
different?
It's localized to your own living space. So not really.
Right.
I mean, they may or may not. If you had like some ferns, that would filter out some stuff actually. Like ferns are really good for households. In Hamilton, you should plant an apple tree.
On it.
There you go.
Will do.
Sweet. Thanks. I never had much luck getting ferns to live in my house. They always died. I don't think it's humid enough. But anyways, I think Jesse has a question as well.
Thanks a lot for the presentation, Alex. I was kind of curious more about the that restoration agriculture and what's sort of, I guess, involved in that, and how we might measure is involved in restoration ag.
Good question. So I had to gloss over that. It was had to kind of pick and choose. This is like a super fast synthesis of a lot of things. Fortunately, restoration agriculture got glossed over. Yeah. So restoration agriculture, also sometimes called conservation agriculture, involves a number of different techniques of shifting from basically industrial agriculture to different methods. Few of the simple things are doing crop rotation. So crop rotation means 1 year you have soybeans in a crop area, and the next year you don't have soybeans in that crop area. You can then just kind of allow it to be on its own for a while and then grow something else there, berries or something else, you know, cabbage, whatever, anything else. And so you rotate what's being grown, and that helps replenish the soil carbon and whatnot. And so basically, really what you're trying to do in regenerative agriculture, to sum it up quickly, is that you want to increase the soil health. One of the main ways of increasing the soil health is to actually increase the soil carbon. And so you're trying to do things that don't destruct soil carbon, or trying to reduce the things that destruct soil carbon, like tilling. Tilling can actually release carbon, even though it looks like you're kind of like aerating the soil, it does that, but at the same time, it releases carbon. So over time, tilling can actually be quite damaging to a soil. You also want to do things that increase the water retention in a soil. So this can mean things like planting sets of crops amongst each other. So not just like one plant in a monoculture. And then the other interesting thing, which I think is pretty cool, is using trees to help grow crops. So some places do, the biggest little farm somebody mentioned did actually a really good documentary. It's about a place in Vermont where they grow maple trees. So some places, what was I going to say? Some places in the West, and especially in the prairies, they already do a lot of agroforestry. So they'll use trees as windbreaks. So they plant them kind of along the edges of crops, stops dust. You can also use them to help water retention between crops. So you have like a crop in kind of this one lane, and then you have a set of, singular type of tree that you have another, like that same crop, and then trees. And that will help water flow below the trees, like between them and underneath the crops. So that kind of helps a lot too. It's like roots help break up the soil. There's a couple of different things. Then silviculture, where you have animals living underneath the trees, kind of thing, like foraging, like pigs, cows, that sort of stuff. So there are kind of any real practice that gets you away from industrial agriculture is mostly what it is. And farmers have been noticing, especially in kind of Central America, where these things have been implemented more, noticing that you actually get way better crops out of it, and crop yields tend to be better. Now, you can't do it fully industrial with machines and stuff. You kind of have to do a lot of labor. So that's a bit of an issue with regenerative agriculture. But at the same time, you get, some people argue, much better crops. You get a lot more crop diversity, and you actually do sequester more carbon. Now, how do you monitor it? You'd have to have very good monitoring of the soil carbon prior to making these changes, and then monitoring the soil carbon as you go along. Most of the carbon sequestration ends up in the soil pool from those activities. So you have to have very solid monitoring of the soil carbon. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that could be monitored remotely, like with remote sensing data. I don't know though. There's definitely like measurement tools that can be used for monitoring soil carbon. But yeah, I'm not 100% certain if it can be monitored like remotely. But yeah, it's all in the soil.
Cool, thanks. Good. Nobody has another question. I have another one too.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering too about like blue carbon as well, with algae blooms or something that is trying to capture carbon in more aqueous environments. Yeah, and
so
there that's been factored into some of the stuff.
So yeah, like kelp farming or those kind of things. Yeah, those work basically the same way. They don't have any of the. Actually, they probably work better. I haven't studied them myself. I know people are trying to, but they're kind of complicated to study. But yeah, I know people are trying to study kelp farming. They'd actually be probably better, depending on like the ecosystem like effects of doing them. They wouldn't have any of the side effects, like fire would not affect kelp farmers. Droughts does not affect them. I don't know about pests. They're kind of like the main things that affect like a forest would not affect those. I don't know if like the warming ocean would really affect it, because the ocean does warm quite slowly. So probably a lot less sensitive to global warming in that sense. However, I don't know what they do to like ecosystems in terms of like ecosystem biodiversity, if they create a benefit for that, whereas like reforestation generally is thought to create a benefit to biodiversity and human well-being. I don't think they would really help human well-being necessarily, unless like people are going out and visiting kelp forests. Probably good for sea otters. But beyond that, I'm not really very familiar with like the co-benefits and risks to carbon sequestration using water species. But yeah, I think it would probably be, they're probably actually really beneficial because they wouldn't have any of the albedo changes. It would actually be quite useful.
Cool, thank you.
Oh yeah, and if you're interested in, I should mention this, if you're interested in regenerative agriculture, there's a prof at UBC who's very big into the spatial aspects of this. His name's Nevin Remenkudi. He's a supervisor of mine. He's much more an expert on that aspect of things. He does a lot of spatial work on sustainable farming.
Cool. Tomer, did you have a question?
All good. Sorry, misclick.
No worries. Julian, go ahead.
I'm in a coffee shop, so I apologize for background noise. But okay, in your opinion, in the Canadian context, we have a lot of trees, and so in the Canadian context, if it weren't for like the consumption of goods, but we're still thinking about the land use, like the amount of people that there are and all the houses and everything. Do you think that we would be carbon neutral here in Canada?
If we like got rid of
We got rid of consumption of products, basically. Like,
yes. So yeah, like no, that's a tough question. Yeah, because neutrality is really dependent on like the baseline of where we're coming from. Maybe we definitely could be. I'd put it that way.
Yeah.
It would be.
Are we in a
possible.
big deficit?
Massive compared to everywhere else, especially by person. If you do it by person, we're one of the worst in the world. But not on consumption. Actually, also on consumption. That's very bad we're bad for consumption here. But the oil sands are the way carbon accounting works currently in international frameworks is whoever produces the oil and gas, especially in oil and gas, is accountable for said emissions. So our main thing is the oil and gas, like that takes up 70-ish, or maybe it's 50 or 70% of our emissions. The next thing is probably agriculture or industry. Maybe it's industry. Agriculture would be up there though. Yeah, it's hard to say whether or not all of the prairies were deforested, but savanna, which is basically what the prairies were, actually has a high biome concentration of carbon compared to other biomes. So we changed that. And we actually would have removed a lot of the carbon that was in the prairies and the savanna in the first place. So yeah, that would have to be accounted for as well. And yeah, I'd say that it could be done in the space that we have, factoring out mostly the oil and gas industry, and say we powered other industries with renewable resources. It could be done, but it would take a lot of work, and I think more than just the Trudeau trees.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Sorry if that was a little tangenty.
I have a question if everyone else is finished asking. I have a question about when you speak about resilience, to resilience with ecosystems and biodiversity. Is that something that is modeled in climate models, in some climate models right now, or can be modeled? And is it something that you're looking at quantifying in your research? And especially in terms of risk. I remember you talking a while back with your research about trying to model fires, which aren't really represented in climate models right now. Is that something you're still looking into?
So fires, I'll start backwards. Fires, there's a number of models that Earth system models that do actually have fairly decent representation of fires. There aren't many Earth system models that have fairly decent representation of a diversity of plants. The Canadian Earth system model, CanESM, has 5 plants, or something. I think it's 5 plant types. The model that I use has also 5 plant types, 2 which are trees, broadleaf and needle leaf trees. That kind of tends to be the way that these things were set up. There are a couple other models. There's a really, really good one out of Potsdam that has 17, I think, plants. So I think that might be the most for like a finer scale Earth system model, which has like a dynamic ocean, multi-layered atmosphere, those kind of things where you would get fires and heat waves and droughts and all those kind of risks. So yeah, not so much in terms of biodiversity, and in terms of resilience, I'm not really aware of any climate models that could be used for it. We kind of just make the assumption that, okay, these are multiple types of trees. And when you have multiple types of trees, you can apply that to some sort of biodiversity index. And we know from biodiversity science that a more biodiverse area should be more resilient. That kind of thing. So we just kind of make a few logical assumptions there.
Right. Does the sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I forgot what I was gonna say. Sorry.
Does the like age of the forest you're looking at, for instance, also contribute to like the resilience aspect of things? Like, would that be something people would want to consider when they're thinking of logging an area, for instance? Like, if a forest is very resilient because of its age, like maybe it should be left alone, kind of thing.
Yeah, old growth forests, going back to where we started, should be more resilient to risks of climate change than new forests. Certain old growth forests, especially depending on how they were managed. Fire management, it turns out, has a very negative impact on the resilience of forests to fires. Normally, without us doing things to it and thinking that we shouldn't have fires in our houses, forests will burn, and then the trees that survive, they'll burn like morely in the underbrush kind of thing, kind of like the grassy underbrush, and the trees that do survive end up with a bark that is very resistant to fire. So Douglas fir is actually quite fire resistant tree. I'm sticking with BC examples here. And what we've done over the past, is we've kind of like 100 years or so, is we've said, hey, wait, fires are bad, we shouldn't have fires. And so one of the things we've done is we've reduced that resilience to fires, just by like stopping them from occurring. So some trees no longer have quite as fire resistant bark as they otherwise would. The less fire resistant trees have been allowed to grow. I think cedars fall into that category. And so they've been allowed to just grow, and these are also things that aren't very fire resistant. So when they do catch fire, they really catch fire. And then the other thing is we've, like, because of logging practices, ended up with this like massive amount of fuel that's just kind of left around after logging occurs and stuff like that. And that kind of creates fuel bases that, so when you do have fires, you end up having really big fires. So the intensity of fires has certainly been increased by the changes that we've made that have reduced things like resilience. So old growth tends to be more resilient.
Okay, cool.
But there could be catastrophic changes that affect that, pests or I don't know, other things.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Is there any kind of last questions? We're just coming up on the hour now. But if there is not, then thanks so much, Alex, for coming to present to us. That was super interesting. And thanks for putting together that list of resources. I'll share that with everyone soon once the
I'll send it
meeting
to
notes.
you. Yeah, a lot of those are just websites that I like. Some of them are companies that you guys might be interested in. Chloe had sent a company. The hell was it called? She said
I think it was
Silvera. Yeah, I have no idea what these guys do by their website. Their corporate website is completely vague. It's like, so you've got a graphic designer, is what I know. Beyond that, who's made graphic designs the last like 5 years, because every graphic design you see now looks the exact same. So beyond that, I have no idea what they do. Did you say Mantle Labs? I don't know what these guys do either. So a few of those things I don't really know what they are, but Planet is a company. I do know what they do. They provide spatial data, some of it at a very fine scale, that can be purchased, I'm pretty sure. So that was kind of one of the links. That's more of a company type thing. And then I might have had some, the rest of it's just like more like things you can read. If you like ever have a question, or if like, you know, you're going up to some meeting and they're like, you're talking about a nature-based solution and you're talking about risk and things like that. Some of those websites are really good, quick, easy to read, very simple to understand. People have made good graphs, you know, that kind of stuff. You don't have to like do all the research. It's just go read what somebody else has written. That's like not in a science paper. They're summarizing. So I provided you what would be the best of those for this subject.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, well, thanks everyone for joining. And yeah, have a good rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon.
Great. Thanks, Alex.
No problem.
Thanks a lot, Alex.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks for having me.